My dad has had many jobs throughout his life, and in the 70s he was a pig farmer. He would raise pigs and sell them by the pound at auction. Then he would deliver them to the buyer. Well, one time he was delivering a load of pigs to a buyer way up in butt-fuck nowhere, Arkansas, and one of the pigs got away. The pig ran into some woods next to the property, and my dad finished unloading the rest of the pigs before going off to find the one that ran away. It took him a while to find the pig, and my dad says he honestly wishes he hadn't. When my dad found the pig, it was dead, with an arrow sticking out of its side. Just before my dad walked up to the pig's body to see who the hell shot his pig, he heard two men coming from deeper in the woods, whooping and hollering. My dad ducked behind a tree just as two really gnarly looking fuckers came running up to the pig. They were both wearing overalls with nothing underneath. One of the men had a really gnarly looking cleft lip. My dad said he looked like the guy from the Hills Have Eyes remake, the one with the road spikes. The other guy was just really old and skinny. The two men picked up my dad's pig and sliced open its stomach, spilling its guts onto the ground. Then the two men dragged the pig off and my dad followed them. The two men walked up to a small ramshackle shack that had 4 people sitting on the front porch. As the men reach the house, a woman comes out with a boy, who is probably too old to be breastfed, attached to her right breast. My dad said that almost every single one of them had a physical deformity, so he noped the fuck out of there. I was an 18-year-old high school senior and was about 3/4 of the way through the year. I had moved that year and switched to a school about 30 minutes away from where I used to go. I stayed in touch with a few people from my old school and got invited to go camping with a few of them over a Memorial weekend, which basically meant getting drunk as fuck in the forest. I invited 2 girls and 1 guy from my new school to come hang out for a night. I met them in the closest town from the campsite about 40 minutes away. The guy, Jeremy, hopped in my car, and the girls followed me up and we got to the campsite without incident. This campsite was 30 minutes away from any human signs of life, outside of a shitty dirt road. The night started off fine with everyone getting completely trashed, and me beating one of the girls I brought named Sarah at beer pong, and she was very drunk and all over me. I guess to the 18-year-old version of me, that night couldn't have been going better at that point. At about 12:30, things started to die down as half of us had already puked and were heading in for the night, and I was much too drunk to even try and fuck Sarah. A lot of the night is still a blur, but I remember climbing into a tent, and there were 5 of us in it, 3 guys and 2 girls. At around 2:30 a.m., I was awoken by the sound of a gunshot. I was still very drunk and had a hard time processing anything, but in my drunken state I figured it was one of the people I was camping with being a dick. One of the guys, Brent, had stayed sober the entire night and had brought his shotgun up with him, so I figured it was him being a prick to everyone who was drunk. I checked my phone and go back to sleep. I fell asleep, and at what I think was around 3 a.m. I was awoken by someone bawling their eyes out, and I'm still having a very hard time processing anything. After about 5 minutes I realize it's Brent, and I stumble out of my tent followed by Jeremy, and I walk out and see Brent is bleeding profusely from his nose and mouth. I run over to him stumbling the entire time. I am then hit in the head with a rock and am knocked unconscious. Everything from this point forward is from Jeremy's point of view. He says I passed by a tree and a large man lunges out and smashes my face with a rock. After hitting me, the man lunges at Jeremy and tackles him straight on his ass. Jeremy at the time was 5'8" and 140 pounds, and he describes the man as being at least 6'4" and 280. Jeremy is being choked to death by this wooded monster of a man, and he hears another gunshot from a pistol. Sarah had managed to find the pistol Brent had also brought with him, and fired a shot, missing the man by a large amount, but it managed to startle him and he sprinted off into the woods. They just let him go, and Jeremy drove me and Brent to the hospital. I had 3 broken teeth and a severe concussion, and Brent had part of his tongue mutilated with a knife and a broken nose. Brent has never talked to me or any of my friends from that trip about what exactly happened when he was outside alone with the man, and refused to give the police much of a description. The man was never caught, and I have never been in the deep forest again. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I am now 21 and live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forests. This night, I was exploring some woods. I usually never went too far in, usually up to a large rock formation I liked to climb, and look out through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot. I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in, a sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying. Faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me. But it was, in fact, crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help, but then I worried that the girl would wander further in beyond earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact location the crying was in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached the small clearing that had only a few trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder, one of the biggest I had ever seen, was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady footsteps advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks, and trees I identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back and I didn't try listening to see if that person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by the window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest shadows, but nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back into that forest again. My dad is a logger, specifically one who operates a tree saw, which is basically a giant machine that is capable of cutting down massive trees and cutting them to specific length, which means he spends a lot of time alone in the deep forests. The way my dad's logging crew was set up is that he would be told where he was supposed to cut down trees, and he would go do that, and be paid based on the amount of trees he cut, not on how long it took him. So my dad used to work 16 to 20-hour days, constantly to get done as quick as possible, and then the rest of the crew would come clean up the trees and ship them to the mill. He used to work around 50% of the time alone, and the rest of the time with another tree saw operator named Rennie. They would use radios to communicate back and forth when they were working together. My dad and Rennie were put on a new job site and were about 10 days in, and everything was going as planned. But they were constantly hearing weird chitter-chatter over the radio. That was such poor quality no words could be heard, and whatever radio channel they changed it to, it followed them. As they progressed through the job and went farther up the mountain, the words from the radio slowly became more audible. Both of them agreed, based on the small parts of the conversation they could hear, that something was wrong. They also started finding weird containers all over the place and signs that people had been there. People should not have been here. This was a 2.5-hour drive up a mountain. They had to spend 3 weeks clearing out the road so their trucks and equipment could make it up. They come to the realization that they are in a very secluded area with people who shouldn't be there. And the worst part is that they aren't scheduled to leave for about another week. They would only leave to refuel the fuel truck with gasoline for the machines. They would buy supplies and sleep in campers. One day, Rennie comes across a tent and calls my dad over. They investigate the tent and find one lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. They investigate the duffel bag and find many pairs of children's underwear, and things that appear to be a rape kit like rope, duct tape, and sketched images of children being molested, and photographs of children that appear unaware that they're being photographed. In the tent, they also found a small amount of food, which includes canned goods and an apple, which proves the tent had been occupied recently, because there was no mold on the apple. They are now on the mountain alone, with which at best case scenario is just a really fucked up individual. Rennie instantly wants to get the fuck out of there, but my dad, being the hardest working person I've ever met, insists that they need to finish the job and get the fuck out of there. They decide that they will not talk over the radios except in cases of emergency, and see if they can hear something over the radio. They are now in close enough range of whoever has been talking over the radio to hear the conversations between two men about collecting water and wood for the fire. Nothing abnormal except for the fact that these guys don't fucking belong here, and that the tent was undoubtedly theirs. At the end of the workday, my dad hears them on the radio talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hops on the radio and attempts to communicate with them about what the fuck they are doing. I believe he said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After this, the conversation between the men abruptly stops, and they never pick up. That night, Rennie wakes my dad up and whispers for him to get his gun. Someone's outside. My dad has told me the first thing he hears when he wakes up is the quiet shuffling of footsteps. My dad fumbles for his gun and finds it, but realizes that he fucking doesn't have it loaded and has little clue to where his rounds are. And Rennie has nothing, and the thought of calling police is absurd for multiple reasons. They hear a jingle on the doorknob and it opens. The camper is far enough off the ground to where you had to jump in, and there is no ladder or footstool. It just stays open and neither my dad nor Rennie move. They hear scratching right outside the door though. After 4 minutes of scratching, my dad can no longer take it and nods at Rennie. He gets up quietly and walks toward the camper door. And the second he reaches it, he is met with intense pain across his right eye all the way to his left cheek. He has been cut and falls out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife gets on top of him, and he is soon being kicked in the top of the head by a man behind him. Rennie leaps out of the trailer and manages to get the man off my dad. And my dad gets up and realizes the second man without the knife is running away, and the man with the knife is scrambling away from Rennie and starts running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Rennie get into the truck and drive to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's cuts, and later report the events to the police. They both quit their jobs, and 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew was finishing up the job, one of them was found gagged, bound, raped, murdered, and thrown into a ditch. No one has ever been convicted for these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and the pupil is disfigured and looks more like a cat's eye than a human's. He suffers PTSD from these events and hasn't slept a good night of sleep since. To preface this, I want to say last year I spent about 32 days in the woods either scouting, hunting, or fishing. The year before that I spent about 22 days. This doesn't include my regular hunts and camping adventures, which in the past 3 years added up to just over 100 days. I've been hunting since I was 9, and have spent a lot of time outdoors in various different parts of the US, and in Canada. I've seen/heard a lot of strange shit, but this takes the cake. I was in Cowhutta, North Georgia wilderness, for 7 days scouting for bears, wild hogs, and deer, prepping for a hunting trip later that year. I had hiked in about 10 miles, then went off the trail for another 3 to 5 miles. Basically, I was out in the middle of nowhere. Since I was alone, I was using a hammock that has a built-in bug net, and had a rain fly over it. I spent about 3 days halfway up a mountain, just looking for a good place to hunt. I saw 3 to 4 good-sized bears, about 10 hogs, and came across some good-sized deer. On the 4th day, I was going to head down to a small stream that I had marked on my GPS and then set up camp, restock on water, and prep for the 2-day hike back. I could have gone faster, but wanted to be able to look for any animal signs along the way. As I was approaching this small stream, I noticed a tent which I was excited to see, as I had been completely alone for a few days and it was always nice to run into another hiker. Generally, us wilderness folks are pretty down to earth. As I got closer to the tent, I noticed that there was a small pack on the ground, just outside of it. I figured the person couldn't have been too far from where the camp was, so I set up my camp about 30 yards away, and with about 4 hours of daylight left, started cooking some dinner. 2 hours later, I was starting to wonder where this person was. Given that I was in the wilderness and it was about a 1+ day hike out, there wasn't much I could do, but I did hike around the site, making a circle as I went out, to look for any signs of a struggle, in case of a bear attack, or maybe they had an injury. I got about 1/4 of a mile around the campsite, walking a circle, but didn't find anything. As night came, no one showed. I started a fire in hopes that the person would be able to find where they set up, and have some light. Fires burn really bright and are very easy to see from far away. After eating, searching, and hoping that the person was going to make it back, I called it a night. I had a small flask with me and took a couple sips of whiskey, jumped into my hammock with my pistol, and attempted to go to sleep. I sleep pretty hard. I mean really hard, regardless of where I am. It literally annoys my friends because I can always seem to fall asleep and stay asleep, regardless of where in the world we are. But this night was different. I felt like something was off, but I figured it was just me worrying about this person, who, by all my accounts, was completely missing. So for the first time in my life, I woke up to the sound of what I thought was footsteps, but not in the sense of footsteps on leaves, but what a heavy-footed person would make walking on an old wood floor. It was extremely loud. I got my gun, grabbed my headlamp, stored in a small compartment up above me, and waited to see if it would stop. Right at that moment, it did. Then I saw something that scared the shit out of me. On my rainfly, the gleam of a flashlight. Faint, but there. I shouted, "Hello?" And right when I did, it sounded like 10 people suddenly running away from me in every direction. I dropped out of my hammock onto the ground, frantically turning on my headlamp, shining it all around me, but didn't see shit. My heart was racing pretty bad, but I thought it might have just been the reflection of the moon on the rainfly. Yeah, that was it. Those footsteps running away from me was probably armadillos, or something, even though their eyes shine, and they're pretty easy to spot. Problem was, there was no moon. I'd never seen an armadillo above 2,000 feet. Not to say they don't live up there, just never seen one. And for some reason, the campsite I set up by was gone. The fire had been put out by water. It was apparent because there was not a damn coal in the thing. I thought for sure it was about 4 a.m., but I had only been asleep for about an hour. At this point, I wanted to leave, but hiking out in the wilderness while it's dark is always a bad idea. So I grabbed my flask, took a swig of whiskey, removed my rainfly so I could see out of my hammock and around the area I was in, and tried my hardest to go back to sleep. I was lying down when I saw some light hit the trees above me. It was clear it was coming from down the stream, and I got out of my hammock and started yelling, "Hey, y'all need help?" No response. I saw whatever was putting out the light and it spun around and started heading down the stream really fast. At this point, my body had pumped through more adrenaline than it had blood, and I was exhausted from it all. I finally was able to fall asleep and woke up around 7 a.m. When I did, I noticed my water filter I had left out was missing. It's a gravity filter, and it hangs on a tree filtering water down into my main bladder that I put in my backpack. And the water bladder, sitting at the base of the tree, looked like it was cut down the middle with a knife. They cut down my bear bag, which had food in it, and took some of it. The creepiest part of all of it was that they went through my bag, which was under my hammock while I was sleeping. I checked my bear bag before I went back to sleep the second time, and it was still there, hanging, and my bag under my hammock hadn't been touched. I packed all my shit and hightailed it out of there, keeping my pistol close to me and moved as fast as I could. I ended up making the hike back in just under 15 hours. I hiked to the trail part in the night, because I wasn't about to spend another night out there. I didn't see anyone on my hike out. There were no cars parked at the trailhead, and the DNR said they had only seen my car there. Since then, I haven't gone out there without any friends. I reported all of this to the local DNR, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I am.